Careful when traveling at night on Route 66. I should have planned this trip better. The sun had disappeared hours ago, and the lone headlight of my car barely illuminated the worn asphalt of the road. The GPS, of course, didn't work in the middle of nowhere. I was lost, and the fatigue was hitting me like a sledgehammer. My name is Jake. I'm a salesman, and in recent weeks, work felt like a constant race. Going from one place straight to another without rest, crossing states in search of clients. I shouldn't have been driving in that mental state, but the idea of sleeping in the car was just as uncomfortable as it was dangerous. Then I saw it. A faintly flickering neon sign in the middle of the darkness. Motel 66. The sign was partially burned out, the letters buzzing in an irregular tone, as if they might shut off for good at any moment. I parked the car in front of what appeared to be the reception, a small and worn-down building with dirty walls and dusty windows. I had stayed in many roadside motels, but this one, there was something wrong with it. Even so, my eyes were barely staying open, and exhaustion overpowered any sense of discomfort. I got out of the car, and the night air was thick, heavy. A sharp smell of humidity mixed with burnt oil lingered. The parking lot was practically empty, except for two other old cars, almost covered in dust. It didn't look like a busy place. I walked to the reception door and pushed it open, the bell above it chiming softly. The reception was just as run down as the outside. Peeling yellow walls, worn-out wooden furniture, and a light bulb flickering weakly from the ceiling. In the corner of the room, an old radio hissed with static, and occasionally a DJ's voice would cut through, mentioning something about disappearances in the area. But I was too tired to pay attention. One night, a raspy voice startled me. Behind the counter was a tall, thin man, too tall for the chair he was sitting on. He wore a dirty cap that partially covered his face, and his smile was wrong. His teeth were too small, aligned in an uncomfortable way. His eyes were half closed, as if he was scrutinizing me more than necessary. "Yes, just one night. I need to rest," I replied, trying not to appear uneasy. He handed me a key with the number 9 engraved on it without saying anything else. The way his fingers lingered over the key sent a shiver down my spine, but I brushed it off. The exhaustion was stronger than any paranoia. "Room 9, second door to the right." He pointed outside without looking at me. His hand, pale and skeletal, seemed to tremble slightly. "Checkout is at 6 in the morning." I thanked him, trying not to seem hurried as I left. The radio in the background continued to hiss, and something about the DJ's tone made me hesitate for a second. He was talking about a missing man, found in a grotesque state, but I tuned it out before hearing the details. I just wanted to sleep. The external hallway was long and desolate, illuminated only by the moon and the weak lights hanging from the walls. I could hear the wind whistling between the doors of the rooms, as if slipping through invisible cracks. I reached room 9, unlocked the door, and pushed it open. The room was nothing more than I expected. Simple, worn, with a bed that creaked slightly when I sat down. I placed my bag on the floor and collapsed onto the bed without even taking off my shoes. The sheets were rough, and the smell of mold quickly filled the room as I lay down. Even so, I was too tired to care. That's when I heard it. At first, it was just a faint sound, like something scratching the walls. I ignored it. Maybe it was the wind. I closed my eyes, trying to drift into sleep, but the sound persisted, insistent. A light tap, tap, tap coming from somewhere inside the walls. I sat up, confused. The noise wasn't loud, but it was disturbing, like someone was trying to call to me from inside the concrete. The scratching intensified, now more rhythmic, almost human. Then, suddenly, a different sound mixed in with the scratching. Laughter. Low, muffled, barely perceptible, but I knew it was there. I stood up and walked to the window, yanking the curtain open. Nothing. The parking lot was still empty, the 2 dust-covered cars still there. But then, something caught my eye. a shadow slowly moving along the hallway. It looked like a man, but his shape was strange, disproportionate. His jaw hung at an odd angle, and his arms dangled at bizarre angles as he walked slowly, as if his joints were dislocated. I froze, watching through the slit in the curtain, trying not to make a sound. The man, or whatever it was, stopped for a moment in front of room 7, tilted his head abruptly, and then continued walking, disappearing into the darkness at the end of the hallway. Silence reclaimed the area, but I couldn't calm down. The scratching in the walls stopped suddenly, and for a brief moment, I thought I had imagined everything, until I heard the radio at the reception again. This time, the static sounded clearer, and the DJ's voice uttered a phrase that made my blood run cold. Found on the road, missing for days. Last seen at Motel 66. I looked at the clock. It wasn't even 2 in the morning, but that night felt far from over. I barely slept. Even when silence dominated the room, the feeling that something was watching me was unbearable. Every movement of the curtain or creak of the wood made me open my eyes and search for signs that it, whatever it was, had returned. And there was that laughter, muffled, hidden in the wind, but unmistakable. I woke up a few hours later, my head heavy and a bitter taste in my mouth. It was hard to tell if what had happened the night before was the result of exhaustion, or if I had really witnessed something strange. The gray morning light began filtering through the window, making the room feel less oppressive. Still, the unease remained. I needed to get out of there as soon as possible. I went to the reception intending to pay for the night and leave, but the man with the dirty cap wasn't there. In his place, a woman sat in an uncomfortable wooden chair, flipping through an old magazine. She had an ordinary appearance, but her eyes were glazed, as if they were dead inside. When I approached, she slowly lifted her gaze, as if every movement was a struggle against gravity. "I need to pay for the room," I said, placing the key on the counter. She stared at me for a long moment, as if trying to remember what to do. "Room 9, right?" Her voice was monotone, without any inflection. I nodded, trying to ignore the growing sense that something was wrong. Next to her, the radio still hissed with its annoying static. Occasionally, the DJ's voice would cut through, mentioning heinous crimes that had occurred recently in the area. But now, the words felt different, more personal. It was as if the DJ knew I was listening. "Unidentified man, missing near Route 66, said the voice on the radio, followed by more static. "Last seen at a roadside establishment." My hands were sweating. I tried convincing myself it was just a coincidence, but the words stuck in my mind. The woman behind the counter didn't seem to notice my unease. She slowly took the money, and her fingers dragged across the counter in the same disturbing way as the man's had the night before. When I finally finished paying, I turned to leave as quickly as possible, but her voice stopped me at the door. "Be careful on the road," she said, emotionless, her eyes fixed on some invisible point on the counter. There was something in her tone that made me hesitate. I tried to convince myself it was just a formality, but a part of me knew there was a hidden warning in her words. Back in the car, I threw my bag onto the back seat and started the engine. I glanced quickly in the rearview mirror and saw, once again, the man who had been wandering the hallway the night before. He was standing, motionless, a few meters away, just watching me. The morning light didn't make his presence any less unsettling. His arms hung awkwardly at his sides, and his jaw seemed even more deformed in the daylight, as if his bones were bent at impossible angles. A chill ran down my spine. I sped off, trying to leave that feeling behind. The car moved along the narrow road back to the main highway. The weather was cloudy, with a layer of fog covering the hills ahead, giving the landscape a desolate air. For a brief moment, I thought the worst was over. Then I noticed the same gas station I had passed the night before was there, to my right. At first, I didn't find it strange. Roads in the middle of nowhere are often monotonous, and gas stations pop up everywhere. But as time passed and I kept driving, that same gas station appeared again. The same sign, the same rusty truck parked at the entrance. I slowed down and looked at the GPS, but the screen still read, no signal. The car radio hissed, broadcasting only static. I kept driving, trying not to let paranoia take over. Maybe it was the exhaustion from the night before still messing with me. Maybe I was just lost. But then the motel appeared. Motel 66, the same flickering sign. The same empty parking lot, except for the same dust-covered cars. My fingers gripped the steering wheel tightly. I was trapped in that damn loop. No matter how much I drove, I always ended up back at the same place. I stopped the car and just sat there, staring at the sign. My mind was confused, and my heart was racing. This couldn't be real. Suddenly, I heard light footsteps outside the car. I slowly turned my head, my stomach churning, and saw a woman standing beside the window. Her face was wrong. Like the man I had seen before, her features seemed misplaced, as if someone had tried to piece her together hurriedly and failed miserably. Her eyes were too deep in their sockets, and her nose seemed slightly crooked. She smiled, but the smile didn't reach her eyes. "Need a room?" she asked, her voice muffled, as if she were speaking through thick glass.
"No."
I started to answer, but my voice faltered. I didn't know what to say. The woman just kept staring at me, as if waiting for me to decide. I sped off again, not caring to look back. The car screeched along the road, the tires squealing as I tried to escape that nightmare. But as I drove, the same pattern repeated. The landscape didn't change. The same fog, the same hills, the same damn gas station. And then, the motel. I slammed the car to a stop, getting out and shutting the door forcefully. My hands trembled as I walked in circles, panic rising. I was trapped, and there was no way out. I was there in front of Motel 66 again. I sat on the hood of the car, trying to catch my breath, but the air was heavy. The feeling that I was being watched consumed me entirely. I looked at the windows of the rooms and saw faces, distorted faces, watching me from the shadows. And then the radio in the reception hissed again. I could hear it, even from a distance, the voice whispering, "Another missing. Last seen on the road, near Motel 66. My heartbeat quickened, and in that moment, I realized that maybe I was next. The sound of the radio filled my ears, even from outside, as if it were calling me back to that hell. I stood there, in front of Motel 66, feeling the panic grow with each passing second. The deformed faces kept watching me from the windows, motionless, but somehow alive enough to send chills down my spine. It was as if time itself had stopped there. The wind blew, but there was no movement in the trees around. The feeling of being trapped in an infinite loop was eating me alive. All I wanted was to leave that place, drive until the world returned to normal. But something or someone didn't want me to go. I decided the only option was to go back inside and confront whatever was happening. There was nowhere left to run. I walked back toward the reception, hesitant, the cold concrete under my feet. The door creaked slightly as I pushed it open, the bell chiming just like it had the night before. The atmosphere, however, felt even more suffocating. The woman was still there, flipping through the same magazine without looking at me. The radio now emitted a continuous static, as if something was about to be revealed. I closed the door behind me, feeling a weight on my back. She finally lifted her head, and her empty gaze met mine. "You shouldn't have come back," she said, her voice cold, devoid of any emotion. Rage and fear mixed inside me. I took a step toward the counter, trying to control the desperation. "What's going on here?" I asked, my voice louder than I expected. "I left. I drove away. But I'm back, and I don't know how. What is this place?" The woman didn't answer immediately. She just watched me, her eyes looking even more sunken and empty. That's when I realized she wasn't human. Or at least not anymore. No one leaves, she finally said. Everyone who comes here stays. There's nowhere to run. Motel 66. It's the end of the road. My knees nearly buckled with the impact of her words. Everything around me began to spin, the air growing heavier. There was nowhere to run. Every time I tried, I ended up in the same place. It was as if the laws of reality didn't apply here. As if I had entered a dimension where escape was impossible. I need to get out of here, I whispered, more to myself than to her. My mind tried to formulate a plan, anything that would give me a chance to escape. The woman smiled, an empty, lifeless smile, and pointed to the radio. They've already told you what happens here. You just need to accept it. My mind raced. The radio. It had spoken about disappearances, people who vanished after staying at the motel. I was being dragged into the same fate. And the others? The ones I saw in the hallway, in the windows? They had also been captured by this place, turned into something different, trapped. I couldn't let that happen to me. Without thinking twice, I ran out the door and back to the parking lot. Panic consumed my thoughts as I tried to come up with a plan. If driving didn't work, maybe there was another way. I needed to leave on foot. Maybe if I got far enough away from the motel, I could break the cycle. I ran past the dust-covered cars and reached the edge of the parking lot. The deserted asphalt of the road stretched out in front of me, swallowed by the thick fog. My heart pounded as I started walking, then running. Every step felt like a monumental effort, as if something invisible was trying to pull me back. The fog grew denser with every meter I advanced, and the sound of my own footsteps seemed muffled, distant. The silence of the road was surreal, but I kept going, hoping that at any moment, the landscape would change and I would be free. I kept running, my heart racing in my chest. Then I heard it. Footsteps behind me. I looked back, my heart nearly jumping out of my throat. There was nothing, no one. The road remained empty, but the footsteps didn't stop. The feeling that something or someone was following me was overwhelming. I sped up, and the footsteps did the same, as if they were synchronized with mine. The fear turned into absolute terror. I knew that whatever was behind me, it wasn't human. I could feel the presence, the cold energy, the darkness closing in. I ran until my lungs felt like they were going to explode, but the footsteps continued, always catching up, always behind me. Finally, I stopped, out of breath, and turned around, expecting to see something. Anything. Nothing. The road was empty, shrouded in fog, but the sound of the footsteps still echoed in my ears. I heard a distant laugh, low and muffled, the same one I had heard inside the room. My blood froze. Couldn't run, there was no escape. And in the distance, in the middle of the fog, I began to see shapes materializing. At first, they were just distorted shadows, vaguely human forms. But as they got closer, their features became clear. They were the same deformed faces I had seen at the motel. The man from the hallway, the woman who appeared beside my car, and others, many others. All of them approaching, all of them watching me. My entire body froze. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't respond. They closed in, slowly, forming a circle around me. Their mouths moved, but the words that came out were unintelligible, a mix of murmurs and static, like the sound of the radio. Suddenly, a cold hand touched my shoulder. I turned to face the touch, and there he was, the man with the dirty cap. His eyes, once half closed, were now wide open, revealing dark, empty sockets. His smile was crooked, as if his muscles had been forced into an expression they didn't belong in. "You shouldn't have come back," he said, his voice sounding like a distant echo. "Now, you belong to Motel 66. Before I could react, I felt the ground open beneath my feet. I fell into the darkness, and everything around me faded away. When I woke up, I was back in room 9. The bed, the smell of mold, the muffled sound of something scratching the walls. The clock read 2 a.m., as if I had never left. I stood up slowly, my head pounding, and walked over to the mirror in the corner of the room. The reflection staring back at me was no longer mine. Next story, the haunted radio. I had been driving for hours on Route 66, and the fatigue was starting to creep in. The signs blurred past in the glow of my headlights, and the rhythmic hum of the tires on the asphalt was almost hypnotic. I needed something to keep me awake. The silence inside the car was oppressive, broken only by the faint hum of the engine and the occasional whoosh of a truck speeding past in the opposite direction. I reached for the radio, trying to tune in to a station. I was in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by deserts and plains, and radio signals seemed as distant as the next town. Twisting the dial, I caught bursts of static, fragments of music that dissolved into white noise, and the occasional voice of a DJ that vanished before I could make out what they were saying. And then, I found something. It was a faint signal, but clear enough to stand out from the static. At first, I thought it was some sort of interview or maybe an old story being broadcast on a late-night show. The announcer's voice was deep, aged, like it belonged to another time. He spoke slowly, with a rhythm that drew me in like a trap. The accident occurred around 11:45 p.m. A black car, speeding down Route 66 near mile marker 147, swerved to avoid a truck that appeared out of nowhere. The driver lost control, and the car flipped multiple times before finally coming to a stop, completely destroyed. I frowned. I was on Route 66, but traffic accidents were common, and I figured it was just a coincidence. Maybe it was a true crime show or a documentary about tragic accidents. I kept listening, curious, even though a chill began to creep up the back of my neck. No one survived. The rescue team arrived too late. That stretch of road, already known for so many strange accidents, added another name to its list of victims. The name of the road echoed in my mind. The casual way the announcer talked about death was unsettling, as if he were describing the weather or commenting on the color of the sunset. The broadcast continued, now with another voice, a younger woman. There was something odd about her tone, like she was speaking with a disturbing, almost mocking smile. Earlier today, we had reports of a car mysteriously disappearing. A blue sedan, Arizona plates. The driver was never found. Authorities suggest the car may have gone off one of the cliffs that line this part of Route 66. But so far, no trace has been seen. I didn't know why, but my hands started to tremble on the wheel. I looked at the radio like it was alive, something watching me. I almost switched stations, but couldn't. Something held me, a sick fascination. Cars disappear here all the time, the announcer continued, his voice heavy and old. Those who leave too late, the ones who ignore the warnings, they're never seen again. Every day, someone drives this road, never to be found. My heart raced faster. I glanced at the clock on the dash. 11:30 p.m. The words "too late" echoed in my head. The road was empty, and the desert around me felt like it was closing in, an infinite blackness. Outside, there was nothing but shadows and the occasional lonely star glinting in the sky. I decided to turn off the radio. For a second, music returned, a soft melody of old jazz, something that felt like it belonged in a black and white film. And then the announcer cut in again, abruptly, with a more serious tone, almost as if he knew something. A young man driving alone in a silver car. He's only a few miles from where the last accident was recorded. Tired eyes, trying to stay awake, but his fate is already sealed. My fingers gripped the steering wheel tightly. I glanced at the dashboard, unable to stop myself. Silver car. My car was silver. I was driving alone. And those words, tired eyes, that was me. My chest tightened, and I twisted the dial furiously, trying to change the station. No matter how much I turned it, the same broadcast continued. the announcer's voice growing louder now, almost close, as if he were sitting in the passenger seat beside me. The driver is already destined to be just another name lost to the stories of Route 66, he said, slowly. Trying to escape, but it's already too late. My heart pounded in my chest. The radio wouldn't shut off, and the static, mixed with voices, filled the car. I looked ahead at the road, and for a split second, I thought I saw something. A figure, standing in the middle of the highway. I swerved hard. The car veered off the road, and I felt the wheels skid on the gravel. I gripped the steering wheel, feeling the car shake before I managed to pull it back onto the asphalt. Everything went silent for a moment. The radio was dead. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself. That had just been my mind playing tricks, the exhaustion. I wiped the sweat from my forehead and glanced back at the dash. 11:45 p.m. Suddenly, the radio crackled back to life, the static slowly building, and the announcer's voice broke the silence. The last broadcast was courtesy of a station that no longer exists, but its audience still drives these dark roads. My whole body went cold. I tried to turn off the radio again, but the button wouldn't respond. The dashboard lights started to flicker, and the engine made a strange noise. The silence of the road now felt alive, as if something unseen was lurking. I was alone, or at least, I thought I was. The clock now read 11:46 p.m. The tension in the air was palpable, as if something invisible was pressing down on the car, forcing my heart to race faster. I glanced at the rearview mirror and out the side windows, hoping to catch sight of any headlights, any sign of life on the road. Nothing, just the empty darkness and the persistent hum of the radio. My hands still shook on the steering wheel, my fingers so tight they ached. I tried to focus on the asphalt, but with every mile, that feeling of not being alone grew stronger. The radio hissed, oscillating between static and broken words I couldn't quite make out. It was as if it was taunting me, whispering truths I didn't want to hear. "You need to calm down," I muttered to myself, closing my eyes for a second. It's just a damn radio. But when I looked back at the road, my stomach dropped. A few meters ahead, there was a car pulled over on the shoulder. Its hazard lights blinked slowly, casting a dim, orange glow over the desolate road like a silent warning. I hadn't seen another car for hours, and that one seemed to have appeared out of nowhere. I slowed down, my eyes locked on the vehicle as I approached. It was an old blue sedan, the paint chipped and the rear window dusty. Something about it felt disturbingly familiar. And then it hit me. The blue sedan. The announcer on the radio had mentioned a car like that, one that had mysteriously disappeared without a trace. A knot tightened in my chest, and my breath quickened. I tried to reason with myself, telling myself that accidents happen all the time. Maybe the driver was just waiting for help. But as I got closer, I realized something was wrong. There was no one in the car. I glanced at the radio, now silent, just a faint static hanging in the air. It was as if it was waiting for something, waiting for me. My mind scrambled to find an explanation, but everything around me felt off, like reality itself was starting to unravel. I didn't know what to do. Part of me wanted to floor the gas and leave the car behind, but another part of me, the part that still clung to reason, told me I should stop, that I should help. If there was someone out there, maybe they needed assistance. I pulled over slowly, just a few meters from the sedan, and killed the engine. The silence that followed was deafening. I could hear my own breathing, heavy and uneven. I reached for my phone to call someone, anyone, but there was no signal. That wasn't unusual out here. As I reached for the door handle, I hesitated. My instincts screamed at me to stay in the car, to not go any closer. But against my better judgment, I got out. The desert wind was cold, biting, and it carried a strange metallic smell I couldn't quite place. I walked slowly toward the sedan. Each step on the gravel sounded amplified, like I was walking into a nightmare. The hazard lights flickered irregularly, and for a moment, I thought I saw a shadow move inside the car. I froze. Hello? Is anyone there? My voice came out softer than I expected. No answer. I approached the driver's side window and peered inside. The interior was empty. No bags, no signs that anyone had actually been there. And then I saw something that made my blood run cold. The sedan's radio was on, emitting the same faint static as mine. It felt like an eerie echo, as if the two cars were synced, trapped in a broadcast that wasn't supposed to exist. A shiver crawled up my spine, and I took a step back, already regretting having stopped. I quickly turned and walked back to my car, every nerve in my body telling me to leave. As soon as I grabbed the door handle, I heard it. A voice, soft and distant, coming from the sedan's radio. I turned slowly, terror swelling inside me. "Chris," the voice whispered. My eyes widened. I heard the name again, like a haunting echo, mixing with the static. "Chris, drive. Don't look back." That voice wasn't a regular announcer. It was low, hissing, and it sounded like it was inside my head. I took a step back, tripping, and scrambled into my car, slamming the door shut. I hit the gas before I even buckled my seatbelt. The tires screeched on the asphalt, and the sedan quickly disappeared from my rearview mirror. My heart was pounding, and I refused to look back. The words of that voice still echoed in my mind. "Don't look back." As the car sped up, my radio hissed back to life, but this time, it wasn't static. It was the same announcer, cold and distant. At 11:50 p.m., a young man named Chris drove past an abandoned sedan on Route 66. He didn't know that car belonged to someone who was never found. Now he's running, trying to escape. But no one escapes this road. My eyes shot to the clock on the dashboard. 11:50 p.m. This couldn't be real. I tried to turn off the radio again, but the button wouldn't move. The announcer's voice continued, relentless, as if narrating my life in real time. "He's scared. He shouldn't have stopped. Now he's part of the road." The headlights illuminated the empty road ahead, but I had the feeling that no matter how far I drove, there was no way out. The broadcast grew louder, more intense. And then, I saw something in my rearview mirror that made my blood freeze. The blue sedan. It was behind me. Its headlights glared like cold, empty eyes, following me closely. I slammed on the gas, my car shaking from the strain, but the sedan was getting closer, relentless, as if it was gliding down the road, ignoring the laws of physics. The voice on the radio changed again, now almost playful, like it was mocking me. "Chris is trying to run, but he already knows. No one escapes Route 66. My eyes widened. I knew something was about to happen, something I couldn't stop. The clock now read 11:59 p.m. The sound of my car's engine seemed on the verge of collapse, roaring with effort as I kept the gas pedal pressed to the floor. The road stretched endlessly ahead of me, a straight line surrounded by nothing but the impenetrable darkness of the desert. The headlights of the blue sedan were still there, shining in my rearview mirror, getting closer. That wasn't an ordinary car. I knew that now. For a moment, I thought it was all an illusion, the result of exhaustion and paranoia. But those lights, they were real, and the radio, still on, narrated my escape like a predetermined sentence. 11:59 p.m., the announcer whispered. His voice seemed amused by my desperation. "Just seconds to midnight, and Chris is about to find out what happens when you try to escape the road." I glanced at the clock on the dash, almost unwillingly. 11:59 p.m. The second hand moved slowly, each tick echoing like an inevitable countdown. I was trapped, and someone seemed to be conducting this sinister orchestra, controlling my every move, every thought, every choice. The announcer knew. He knew everything. The sedan's headlights were so close now that I could make out the car's shape. It glided down the road, smooth, like a predator that had no need to hurry, just waiting for the perfect moment to strike. My mind raced as fast as the car, searching for an exit, an alternate route, anything that could save me. That's when I saw a turn ahead, a narrow off-ramp almost hidden by the darkness. Without thinking, I yanked the wheel hard, feeling the tires skid over the gravel as the car groaned in metallic pain. For a second, the sedan vanished from my rearview mirror. The relief was almost instant, a sensation that crumbled the moment the lights reappeared. But this time, instead of being behind me, they were in front.
Impossible.
I knew it was impossible, but the sedan was there, parked across the road like a sentinel of death. Its headlights blinded me, huge and bright, impossible to ignore. I slammed on the brakes, the car screeching to a stop just a few feet away. Silence fell. No sound, not even the radio, which had been my constant torment, remained quiet. My breathing was the only thing I could hear, fast and uneven. The sedan was still, unmoving, but I knew I wasn't alone. Something was in that car. Something was watching me. I knew what was coming. Part of me had known since the moment I heard my name on the broadcast, but another part, the part still clinging to rationality, had tried to resist the idea. The announcer wasn't just narrating old accidents. He was predicting. The radio wasn't just telling stories. It was creating realities. "It's midnight," the voice on the radio said, breaking the silence. Instinctively, I looked at the clock on the dash.
12 Uhr nachts.
Everything happened at once. The sedan's headlights blinked out, leaving the world in a darkness so deep it felt like I was falling into an abyss. I barely had time to process what was happening when something moved on the road in front of me. Emerging from the shadows that surrounded the car, a figure. It walked slowly, without hurry, emerging from the darkness with a disturbing calmness. It was hard to make out its details clearly, as if its presence was intentionally blurred. A silhouette that didn't want to be seen but couldn't be ignored. I felt, with every fiber of my being, that this thing was not human. My hands, cold and sweaty, gripped the steering wheel, and my entire body was paralyzed with fear. I tried to step on the gas, but my feet wouldn't respond. The car engine growled, but the vehicle didn't move. The figure kept approaching, and with every step, the radio came back to life, as if synced with that apparition. "Chris now understands," said the voice, quieter now, almost a whisper. "He shouldn't have tuned into the station, but now he's part of the story." I wanted to scream, but my throat was dry. Sweat ran down my face, and I could barely breathe. The figure stopped just a few feet from my car, the dim glow from the dashboard barely illuminating part of its face. What I saw made my stomach churn. It was a deformed face, as if it had been crushed and stretched in an accident, a grotesque mix of flesh and metal. Its eyes, or what was left of them, stared directly at me, empty, lifeless, but somehow aware. That thing was a victim, one of the stories the radio had narrated, trapped forever on that cursed road. "You shouldn't have stopped," it whispered. Its voice didn't come from its mouth, but from the very static that filled the car, as if it was part of the radio signal itself. "Now you'll be part of the road, too." I had to get out of there. I had to do something. In a desperate move, I tried to start the car again. The engine roared, but nothing happened. The figure, now next to the window, leaned in closer. I could hear the sound of its broken, deformed body scraping along the asphalt, the sound of metal grinding and twisting. With no other option, I threw open the door and ran. I didn't know where I was going. I just knew I had to get away. The road stretched out endlessly in front of me, but I ran, hearing the heavy footsteps of that thing behind me. The radio, though distant now, could still be heard, its supernatural broadcast following me. "Chris is running, but he knows there's nowhere to go." My legs burned. My heart pounded so hard I thought it might explode, but I kept running. I looked back only once, and the blue sedan was there, parked, watching me like a hunter that already knew the fate of its prey. I stumbled and fell, my knees scraping against the gravel of the road. That's when I realized there were no footsteps behind me anymore. I looked around, but the darkness was total. I was alone, or at least I seemed to be. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself, and the profound silence surrounded me. But then, the radio spoke again, this time directly inside my mind, as if the broadcast was now a part of me. The road never ends, and you, Chris, you'll never leave it. Despair overwhelmed me, and I stood up again, ready to run. But before I could take a step, a light flickered in the distance. Headlights. For a second, I thought it was help, another driver. But then I saw the familiar lights, the sedan. It was coming straight toward me. Fast, impossible to avoid. The sound of a crash, of metal twisting and bones breaking, filled the air. And then, the radio went silent. The next day, the police found a silver car on Route 66, overturned on the side of the road. There were no signs of another vehicle involved. The driver, a young man named Chris, was never found. The only thing the investigators discovered was the car's radio, still on, emitting static, and occasionally whispering his name. Next story. The city that never was. I wasn't looking for inspiration. Not really. What I needed was distance. Distance from deadlines, from publishers breathing down my neck, and most of all, from my own sense of failure. I'd lost count of the hours I'd spent staring at a blank page, waiting for something, anything, to come to me. So, I packed a bag, grabbed my old car keys, and drove west, with no particular destination in mind. The stretch of Route 66 I found myself on was as barren as the ideas in my head. The road stretched endlessly, with only the occasional gas station or diner breaking the monotony. I'd heard stories about people finding themselves out here, rediscovering their passion or their purpose. For me, it was just a way to avoid thinking, a way to keep moving forward even when my mind was stuck in reverse. It was late afternoon when I first saw the sign. Welcome to Silverbrook. A small, worn sign half hidden by desert dust and weeds, pointing down a road I didn't remember noticing on the map. In fact, I didn't remember seeing this town listed anywhere in my research before setting out. But something about the name tugged at me. Silverbrook. It sounded quaint, peaceful even, like the kind of place where someone could find quiet, or at least a stiff drink and a cheap motel. The road curved off the highway, leading through sparse clusters of trees and into the heart of what looked like a typical small town. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the streets as I passed by the first few houses. Everything about the place screamed small-town America. A diner on the corner, an old barber shop, a gas station that probably hadn't been updated in 50 years. A little rundown, sure, but that was part of the charm. Except, there was something off. Maybe it was the way the streets were so quiet, too quiet for a place that seemed lived in. No sound of cars, no kids playing, no barking dogs. Just silence. As I drove deeper into the town, I started seeing people, locals I assumed, walking the sidewalks, standing outside shops, chatting in front of homes. But the closer I looked, the stranger it seemed. They moved slowly, deliberately, like actors waiting for their cue. Their conversations felt stiff, mechanical. I swear, no one even glanced in my direction as I passed. I pulled up in front of a bar with a faded sign above the door, simply reading Jim's Tavern. My throat was dry, my legs stiff from hours of driving, so I figured this was as good a place as any to stop. The moment I opened the door, a wave of cool air and the smell of stale beer hit me. The bar was mostly empty, except for a few locals who sat at the counter, staring into their drinks. "Hey, you open?" I called out, not quite sure if anyone even worked here. The bartender, a man with a weathered face and a gray mustache, glanced up at me, his expression flat. "Sure," he muttered, voice low, as though he were reciting a line he'd said 1,000 times before. "What'll it be?" Whiskey. Neat, I said, sliding into a stool. He poured it without a word, then turned back to wiping the counter, his movements slow, methodical, like he had all the time in the world. I took a sip, letting the burn warm my throat, but the strange quiet of the place started gnawing at me. The few patrons in the bar continued their conversations, but they didn't sound real. It was like they were repeating the same sentences over and over, a loop of meaningless chatter. I couldn't shake the feeling that they were stuck, like actors in a play who didn't know the scene had ended. I checked my phone. No signal. That was weird. I'd had service just fine out on the highway, but now, nothing. I didn't think much of it at the time. Small towns like this, off the beaten path, they were bound to have spotty coverage. I finished my drink and tossed a few bills on the bar. Is there a motel nearby? I asked the bartender. He didn't look up. 2 blocks down. You'll see it. I thanked him, though it didn't seem like he cared one way or the other, and headed back outside. The air was thick with the smell of desert dust, and a strange haze had settled over the town, muting the colors of the buildings and sky. The sun was still hanging low in the sky, not quite setting, but not rising either. Just stuck there as if time had hit pause. As I walked toward the motel, I started noticing other odd things. People sweeping their porches, even though there was nothing to sweep. Cars sitting idle at intersections with their engines off. A couple standing in front of a cafe, talking in hushed tones but not moving, like they were waiting for something, frozen in place. The more I looked, the more unsettling it became. It was like the whole town was caught in a dream, or maybe a nightmare that no one realized they were in. I found the motel easily enough. Silverbrook Inn. An old building with peeling paint and a neon vacancy sign that flickered weakly. The office was empty, so I rang the bell, and after a moment, a woman appeared from the back. She had the same glassy-eyed look as the others, her voice distant as she handed me the key to room 12. "Enjoy your stay," she said, though it didn't sound like she meant it. More like she was repeating a line she had been saying for years, without thinking. I tossed my bag on the bed and sat down, trying to shake off the growing unease that was crawling under my skin. The room was small, clean enough, but there was something about the silence that made me restless. I turned on the TV, flipping through static-filled channels until I gave up and shut it off. Outside, the sun still hadn't set, or risen. I glanced at my watch. 7 p.m. It felt like hours had passed since I'd arrived, but time hadn't moved. I stared at the watch face, watching the second hand tick forward, then back again, like it couldn't decide which way to go. I grabbed my phone, hoping to pass the time, but as soon as I unlocked it, I noticed something strange. My recent search history, it was gone, and in its place was a single note, typed in the phone's notepad app. "Welcome to Silverbrook, Tom. You've always been here." My blood ran cold. How did they know my name? I hadn't spoken to anyone about who I was, where I was from. My heart started racing as I scanned the room, suddenly feeling like I wasn't alone. And that's when I heard it. A soft, rhythmic knocking at the door. Not loud, not aggressive, just steady. Knock, knock, knock. I stood frozen, the silence pressing in from all sides, wondering if I had made the biggest mistake of my life stepping into this town. Knock, knock. I didn't want to open the door, but I knew I had to. My hand hovered over the doorknob, the soft knocking filling the small motel room like a slow heartbeat. Each knock sent a jolt through my chest, but I didn't move. Couldn't. I was caught between fear and curiosity, my mind racing with questions I couldn't answer. How did they know my name? Who was out there? Knock, knock. Finally, swallowing hard, I turned the knob and pulled the door open. No one was there. The hallway outside was empty, dimly lit by a single flickering light bulb hanging from the ceiling. I leaned out, glancing left, then right, but saw nothing but cracked pavement stretching toward the silent street. My pulse was hammering in my ears as I stepped outside, half expecting someone to jump out of the shadows. But the only sound was the low hum of that dying light bulb and the distant rustling of wind through the trees. I stepped back inside, shutting the door behind me, but the unease gnawed at me, growing like a weight in my chest. I couldn't stay in that room. I needed answers, or at least a distraction from the creeping feeling that something was watching me. The town was too quiet as I walked back down the main street. The same people were still standing where I'd left them, like statues. The couple by the cafe hadn't moved. The man sweeping his porch was still stuck in that repetitive motion, his broom barely making contact with the ground. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. It was like the town had frozen in time, everyone locked in a loop, going through the same motions over and over again. I walked faster, my footsteps echoing down the empty street. The sun was still hanging low in the sky, casting the same long shadows it had when I first arrived. I didn't know how much time had passed, but it felt wrong. Everything felt wrong. I needed to talk to someone who might have answers. The bar, maybe? The bartender had at least spoken to me, though I doubted he'd be any more helpful now. But before I could head back in that direction, I saw it. A small building with a faded wooden sign above the door. Silverbrook Library. A library. My instincts as a writer kicked in. If this town was off the map, maybe there were records, books, something that could explain why no one seemed to notice how trapped they were. I quickened my pace, pushing open the heavy door and stepping inside. The air was thick with the scent of old paper and dust. The place was empty, no librarian, no visitors. Just rows of shelves filled with books, the dim light barely enough to read by. I wandered deeper into the stacks, trailing my fingers over the spines of the books, though I couldn't shake the eerie sensation that none of them had been touched in years. And then I found the first one, a book with no title, just a plain, black cover. Curious, I pulled it off the shelf, flipping it open. The pages were blank, every single one. I pulled another book off the shelf. Blank. Another. Blank. My hands trembled as I grabbed book after book, opening each one to find the same thing. Nothing. Hundreds of books, completely empty, like they were waiting for someone to fill them. I moved to the back of the library, where a large wooden desk sat beneath a single lamp, its light casting deep shadows across the floor. Behind the desk was a shelf different from the others. The books on this shelf looked newer, less dusty. I approached slowly, my breath catching in my throat when I saw the titles. The first book I pulled down had a name on the cover. Mary Higgins. No title, just the name. I opened it, and this time the pages weren't blank. Instead, they were filled with neat, handwritten text. I skimmed the first few lines, feeling a chill crawl up my spine. It was a diary, a detailed account of a woman named Mary Higgins and her life in Silverbrook. How she had arrived here by accident one day while on a road trip, much like me. At first, the entries seemed normal, mundane, recounting her days in the quiet town. But as I flipped further, the entries grew more frantic, more desperate. I've been here for days now, but the sun hasn't moved. Every morning I wake up at the same time, but it's always dusk. The people, they're not real. They can't be. I've tried to leave, but every road brings me back to the same place.
I'm trapped.
I can't get out. The last entry was scrawled in shaky handwriting. I found the library today. I found the book with my name on it. I know now. I know what this place is. I know what's going to happen to me. My heart pounded in my chest as I reached for another book on the shelf. John Reynolds. Again, no title, just the name. I flipped through it and the same story unfolded. John had arrived in Silverbrook by chance, thinking it was just a small, unmarked town. But soon he noticed the same patterns, the same strange behavior from the locals. The entries ended abruptly, with John realizing he was never going to leave. A cold sweat broke out on the back of my neck. My hands were shaking as I put the book back on the shelf, but I couldn't stop. I had to know. My gaze darted to the last book on the shelf, and when I saw the name on the cover, my blood turned to ice. Tom Marshall. My name. My mouth went dry as I reached for the book. It felt heavier than the others, the weight of it pulling at me like gravity. I hesitated, my fingers brushing the cover, but I knew I had to open it. The first page was blank. So was the second. But when I flipped to the third, my own handwriting stared back at me. The words described me driving down Route 66, feeling lost, searching for inspiration. The details were exact. What I was thinking, how the sun had felt on my face, the gas stations I'd passed, the moment I saw the sign for Silverbrook. I kept flipping, my stomach churning as the book described me walking into town, the bartender pouring my drink, the soft knocking on my motel door. The last entry, the one that hadn't been written yet, was waiting for me. The page was blank, but I knew it was going to end the same way as the others. I slammed the book shut, my heart racing. I had to get out. I didn't care how, but I couldn't stay here any longer. I shoved the book back onto the shelf and sprinted for the door, bursting out into the street. The sun still hadn't moved. The same people were still walking in their loops, frozen in time. I ran to my car, fumbling with the keys, my hands shaking so hard I could barely get them in the ignition. I turned the key and the engine roared to life. I hit the gas, tires screeching as I tore down the street, desperate to put as much distance between myself and that cursed town as possible. But when I reached the edge of Silverbrook, the road curved, and suddenly, I was back at the center of town. The Welcome to Silverbrook sign stood in front of me once again. I slammed on the brakes, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. I hadn't turned around. I hadn't made any wrong turns. But somehow I was back, trapped, just like the others. The engine idled as I sat frozen behind the wheel, staring at the Welcome to Silverbrook sign, as if it had materialized out of thin air. My mind was racing, searching for an explanation that made sense, but every possible answer felt impossible. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't dreaming. And yet, here I was, back at the same spot I tried so desperately to leave behind. My fingers gripped the steering wheel so tightly they turned white, but my mind was blank, empty of options. Running wasn't working. Neither was logic. The book with my name on it flashed through my mind, and a cold shiver ran down my spine. It was like the town itself was writing the story of my life, one step ahead of me, anticipating my every move. How do you outrun something that already knows where you're going? I pulled a shaky breath, forcing myself to think. There had to be a way out. The road had brought me back, but maybe I hadn't gone far enough. Maybe if I kept driving, if I pushed harder, I'd break through whatever invisible wall this place had built around me. I threw the car into drive and slammed my foot on the gas, speeding past the sign and down the empty road, the town disappearing in my rearview mirror. But the further I drove, the more the scenery around me started to blur. The trees lining the road seemed to bend and warp, stretching like shadows in the wrong direction. The road itself started to ripple, as if it was a mirage, shifting beneath my wheels. My heart pounded in my chest as I kept my foot pressed to the floor, my eyes locked on the horizon. Couldn't stop, couldn't turn back. And then, without warning, the road in front of me disappeared. The asphalt seemed to drop off into nothingness, like the world had simply ended. I slammed on the brakes, the car screeching to a halt, skidding to the edge of the black void that yawned in front of me. I stared, wide-eyed, at the sheer emptiness beyond. No landscape, no sky, just a vast, endless blackness that stretched out in every direction. It was like the town had limits, a boundary I couldn't cross. I sat there, gasping for breath, the sound of my heartbeat loud in my ears. There was no way out.
No escape.
I backed the car up slowly, my mind reeling. Whatever was happening here, whatever force was keeping me trapped, it wasn't going to let me go. Not like this. The road seemed to curve once again, pulling me back toward the center of Silverbrook. I could see the town looming ahead, its streets lined with the same frozen figures, still stuck in their endless routines. I didn't know what else to do, so I drove back to the library. The heavy door creaked as I pushed it open, stepping inside once more. The air was still thick with dust and the smell of old paper. I walked slowly through the stacks, my footsteps echoing in the silence, feeling as though I was being watched by the empty books on the shelves. I found my way back to the small wooden desk where I had discovered the book with my name on it. It sat on the shelf right where I had left it. The sight of it sent a cold wave of dread through me, but I knew I couldn't leave without confronting whatever this was. If I was going to escape, I had to understand what was happening. I had to finish the story. I reached out and pulled the book from the shelf. This time, when I opened it, the pages weren't blank. The words were already there, written in my own hand, chronicling everything I had done since I left the library. The desperate drive, the black void at the edge of town, my return here. Every thought, every emotion, down to the last detail. It was all there, as though someone had been watching me the whole time. My breath caught in my throat as I flipped to the final pages, dreading what I might find. The last few lines were waiting for me, written in a way that felt both inevitable and terrifying. Tom returned to the library. He thought he could escape, but deep down he knew the truth. Silverbrook wasn't a place you left. Silverbrook was a place that consumed you. And as Tom turned the page, he realized he was no longer reading about himself. He was reading about what the town wanted him to become. I stared at the words, my hands shaking. The room felt colder, darker. My vision blurred as I flipped the final page, desperate to see if there was more. And there was. One last entry, written in shaky handwriting that looked like mine but wasn't. Tom Marshall finally understood. He wasn't a visitor to Silverbrook. He was always part of it. The town had written him into its story, and now he would remain. Forever. As soon as I read the last word, I felt it. A heavy, sinking sensation in my chest. The weight of inevitability pressing down on me, dragging me deeper into the story, into the town's grip. My body felt distant, like I was floating outside myself, watching as the town slowly claimed me. I dropped the book, backing away from the shelf as the room began to spin. I ran out of the library, stumbling into the street. The sky was still frozen, that strange eternal dusk casting long shadows across the ground. The same people were there, still stuck in their endless loops, but now I understood. They weren't real people. They were like me, trapped in Silverbrook, written into the story, forced to play out the same scenes over and over, forever. I tried to scream, but the sound died in my throat. And then I saw him, a man standing across the street, watching me. At first, I thought he was just another one of the town's frozen figures, another puppet caught in the loop. But then he moved, his head tilting slightly as if he was studying me. His face was eerily familiar, like looking into a mirror. My heart stopped as I realized what I was seeing. It was me, or at least someone who looked exactly like me. The man smiled, a slow, knowing smile that sent a chill through my bones. He waved, as if welcoming me to join him. I stumbled back, my mind racing. This was it. This was what the book had been leading to. I wasn't just trapped in the town. The town was rewriting me, replacing me. I was becoming part of it just like everyone else. The man, the other me, turned and started walking down the street, disappearing around a corner. I didn't want to follow, but I knew I had no choice. My feet moved on their own, as if pulled by some invisible force, dragging me toward whatever end Silverbrook had planned for me. As I rounded the corner, I saw it, the bar, the diner, the motel. Everything was exactly as it had been when I first arrived. The town had reset itself, and I was part of the reset. My place in the story had been written. I was no longer Tom Marshall, the writer searching for inspiration. I was just another character in Silverbrook's endless, repeating tale.